Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we are going to switch into English right now. I hope the translation is okay. Thank you. It is my honor and pleasure to be introducing Erin, our keynote speaker of the day. This is the last minute fill-in. I was not supposed to be here, but it's really an honor. I'm honored to be here. So I'd like to introduce Erin, and before introducing her, before taking the step to coming here, I asked her how she would like to be introduced, and we had this wonderful conversation about how we want to be, known by our audience. And so I'll sort of improvise here and say half of what Erin told me and half of what I think it's a nice story about how I found out that Erin exists and how I learned so much from her, as you've seen this morning. So Erin introduces herself as a researcher and educated, who is focused on open source software, which I think is a particularly interesting topic for us, open source, right? And digital infrastructure and critical approaches to new technologies. She received her PhD from the City University of New York at the Graduate Center there. And she, her interesting work, let me tell you the story. Is that a spoiler? Okay, if it's not a spoiler. We found out about Erin because they have this transdisciplinary group, and we were talking about digital rhetoric and how human communication actually takes place through digital technologies, and we are particularly interested in a critical view of how technology transforms our communication into something different that has pros and cons as everything else, right? And in our group, we wanted to have some access. We were looking for written material for books and articles who were exploring the matter of interference and technological mediation with a more critical view. And we came upon this person at the City University of New York who had a PhD using foul play, right? And the title of her dissertation is fantastic. It's called Softer of the Oppressed. So it sounds very familiar, isn't it? So it is really my pleasure to have Erin here. And I think I learned a lot from her. And I'm sure you and I, we are going to learn a lot from her this afternoon. Thank you, Erin, for being with us, for accepting our invitation, and for coming all the way from San Diego, to Rio de Janeiro, with the two kids at home. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have my slides, please. And boa tarde, obrigado por me receber. Lamento não poder falar português. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you again so much to the organizers for putting together this wonderful gathering, for bringing me here, and also for enduring my avalanche of emails about travel logistics. I'm sure even the most critical of you probably wanted an AI to respond to me over the last few weeks. So thank you. Bear with me today because my notes are here. My slides are there. I have this remote. I have this remote. I'm just going to do what I can here. Okay. So it's got this closer. So it's been very stimulating to hear today's talks on the impact of new technologies on knowledge and production and education. And I too am concerned about the impact of these technologies in these areas and the fact that they are setting new intellectual norms too quickly for us to sufficiently understand and direct. So today I want to talk about an infrastructure of wisdom, the hope for thought in the age of alienated intelligence. I want to invite us to view these technologies as part of the modern infrastructure of thought, which has significant influence on the character and outcomes of thinking today. While there is much to be gained through this modern infrastructure, such as the acceleration of scientific discovery, which we heard about earlier, or the broadening influence of academic thought on public discourse, I will argue that this infrastructure possesses overarching tendencies that also obscure, restrain, and limit thought, and prevent thought's awareness of its dynamic relationship with infrastructure. I will suggest that these tendencies can be understood as part of a process of alienating intelligence of the knowledge producers for an agency and intelligence that is outside of their interests. Yes, this happens perhaps most obviously in today's modes of producing artificial intelligence, where user data is exploited in the generation of AI systems. But I will show that this logic is deeply rooted at an infrastructural level in ways that need to be addressed if we are to correct the alienating processes of artificial intelligence. Finally, by taking advantage of the fact that there are philosophers in this room, I will make a plea for a different infrastructural logic, one which I will call, perhaps too boldly, an infrastructure of wisdom. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge that the perspective I'm bringing forth here is US-centric, which I'm excited to broaden and interrogate through conversations with you all. So let's get started. First, what you see here flashing before your eyes are architectural plans for national museums around the world. These plans were displayed in an exhibit at Harvard University that highlighted the link between the design of libraries and the national ambitions of the countries that built them. Libraries, of course, are a type of infrastructure, an infrastructure of information. And so here we have before us an obvious example of how information infrastructure expresses the interests of its makers. It's not always so obvious though. So let's keep this in mind as we go through the talk. One more thing. Since we are at a Catholic university, I would also like to call upon the guidance of this particular holy woman for this talk. Does anybody know who this is? Who is this woman sitting in this beautiful information infrastructure? It's beautiful library. She is the Catholic nun Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who lived in Mexico City in the 17th century. And in one of her poems or her prayers, she says something that is very interesting to meditate on when thinking about artificial intelligence. Did it happen?
Go ahead.
Okay. She says, let my wits not always be opposed to my own advantage. Let my wits not always be opposed to my own advantage. This is a curious request, implying that a person's wits or intelligence might somehow be harmful to them. What do philosophers think of that? She, of course, is making this plea in the context of her spiritual life. She is hoping her intelligence won't endanger her soul, a theme often touched upon in Catholic discourse. But even in a secular consideration of new technologies and knowledge production, I think her plea is quite relevant. It invites us to wonder how we might judge whether our intelligence is working for or against us. This question is on many people's minds today with regard to artificial intelligence, giving it an increasing presence in our lives. How should we judge artificial intelligence? How do we talk about weighing its potential harms and potential benefits? Is it inherently harmful, or can it be shaped some way, somehow, in ways that satisfy our intellectual and ethical concerns? I want to tell you a story about how I started thinking about this. So I spent 10 years working at the intersection of technology and humanities in higher education. Currently, I work at a tech startup in software supply chain security. We're enabling the visibility of open source code and massive software supply chains that power everything from our smartphones to nuclear reactors is a complex technical challenge, but also a cybersecurity necessity. But before all of this, I was a Luddite, or at least I was a failed Luddite. In my 20s, I spent a year off the grid trying to disconnect from technology. And I ended up realizing, like many failed Luddites before me, that disconnecting from technology is too hard. And I also like hot showers. So I ended up in graduate school in literature, looking for a way to think about technology, why I mistrusted it, but why I couldn't quit it. And while there, I read science and technology studies, media theorists, digital humanists. But at the end of the day, it was your Paulo Freire, the great philosopher of education, that gave me the strongest toehold for thinking about the problem of technology. And it's very simple. For Freire, oppression is the denial of a people's right to critically understand and transform the world for their interests. He talked about how education can be used to carry out this oppression. I found that this idea was equally relevant to software. Through closed source code, business practices, consumer computing culture, and a variety of other components, users are predominantly denied the right to critically understand and transform their software for their interests. Like the oppressive form of education that Freire described, this oppressive mode of software is so normalized, so ingrained in the very logic of our computing infrastructure that it can seem ridiculous to think it could be any other way. In fact, you might say, what good would it be for me to have the source code of Microsoft Word? What good would it be for me to have access to Google's search algorithms? What good would it be for me to see OpenAI's entire code base? I am just a simple user. I wouldn't be able to understand that code. I wouldn't be able to change it. True, but remind yourself, neither could any single computer engineer today. Software is too complex. It takes vast teams of engineers to develop and maintain the digital infrastructure of our world. The difference is they have the tools and incentives and the sufficient scared skills to collaborate, whereas we, the simple users, do not. If you start digging into the history of computing and the diverse subcultures and computing philosophies that emerged within that history, you begin to see that this lack of user agency is not an inevitable feature of computing, but a historical development shaped by human choices. In this history, you can find many different philosophies and practices of computing that gave users, even non-technological users, broader control of their tools in ways that led to fascinating results. One of the things that I find very interesting in this history is the university's role in its development. It is, in fact, the university is, in fact, in my view, the mother of computing. And in its early days, she was very liberal with her computing offspring, allowing a plurality of visions of computing to bloom. Something happened, though, that greatly changed the atmosphere. And somehow the university changed course with computing, and the diversity of approaches to computing withered on the vine. The university, of course, has been a critical player in the development of computing since the very beginning. It is the mother, to use that metaphor again, of the knowledge which enabled the development of the mathematical, scientific, and engineering foundations that made the computer possible. The university has also been a collaborative partner for many, if not most, computing milestones. And I'm thinking here of everything from the ENIAC, the first electronic general-purpose computer built at the University of Pennsylvania in 1945, to the Dartmouth Conference in 1956, where artificial intelligence was coined, to the development of Google as part of the dissertation work by 2 PhD students at Stanford. We could go on. One thing that stands out in this history is that before the commodification of computing, there was a culture of freely sharing and modifying software within academic settings. And it wasn't just computer scientists who were participating in this. Students and researchers across disciplines were also often involved in this work. This culture of freely sharing and modifying software enabled a broader and more diverse group of people and disciplines to participate in the purpose and practice of computing. As a result, there were software projects that embodied different disciplines, different worldviews, which in turn influenced the character of the intellectual activities and outputs they supported. You might be curious to know what I mean. Well, for example, have you ever asked yourself what sort of writing software Aristotle would build if he were a developer today? Would it look the same as Google Docs? Would it look the same as Microsoft Word? If not, what would it look like? You're probably drawing a blank, so I'm going to help you out. In 1979, Hugh Burns, a graduate student in rhetoric, developed a chatbot named Topoi to help students think deeply about their topic in the ways that Aristotle encouraged. And here is a picture showing on the left the original source code for Topoi, which he included at the back of his photocopied dissertation. And on the right, you see actually a reproduction of Topoi that was made by a developer who saw me talk about it in one of my talks, and then went and chased it down and recreated it. I can give you the link if you want to take a look at it. Topoi, basically how it works is you log in, it asks you your name, it asks you what you're writing about, you tell it, and then it starts asking you a series of questions. This is, of course, a not smart chatbot, right? It's 1979, it's all hand-coded with lots of love by Hugh Burns. It's a decision tree chatbot or a rule-based chatbot. He's writing it to anticipate what your responses are, and you go back and forth. But when I played with it after the developer rebuilt it, I found it was actually a very satisfying experience. There's a lot of humor in it that I just don't experience in ChatGPT. So I wanted to point out this one project. And oh yeah, there's the link if you want to carry. I can send it to you later too. Okay. Next. Thank you. There are many examples of computing projects driven by the broader academic community, which exhibited a much smaller gap between the users and creators of the computing system than the gap we see between users and developers today. Another example of this is Plato, the first generalized computer-assisted learning program begun at the University of Illinois in 1960. Plato is often credited as having pioneered many of the modern features of the web, such as forums, message boards, remote screen sharing, and multiplayer computer games. But what I think is most interesting about it and most unique is that educators and students across disciplines played an active role in developing it. This is such an important part of the Plato project that they developed a special programming language called Tutor to enable non-programmers to develop instructional programs for non-technical disciplines. Something I want to point out, the development of the core features of the internet, the features that we find critical today, were in fact imagined and developed to respond to real needs in the classroom. These gifts to the internet are thus a product of two things: community-driven infrastructure, or infrastructure that is developed in close collaboration with the community that it serves, and the real-world needs of the classroom. The internet is EdTech gone mainstream. There are many other examples of computing philosophies that emphasize the same form of greater user agency that were developed within the university or in strong connection with the university. In 1968, Alan Kay proposed the idea that every student should be given what he called a Dynabook, or a personal computer for education that a student would have complete control over and be able to program and customize over the course of their education as their interests and skills evolve. There's also Ted Nelson's 1974 Computer Lid Manifesto, which protested against the common assumption that only certain people should be able to understand and control technologies. And I'll just read a few quotes from that manifesto. Any nitwit can understand computers, and many do. Unfortunately, due to ridiculous historical circumstances, computers have been made a mystery to most of the world. And also, it is imperative for many reasons that the appalling gap between public and computer insider be closed. There is also the Free Software Foundation, founded by Richard Stallman at MIT in 1984, which asserted that people should have the right to study, modify, and share source code. In each of these visions, experiments, and practices, there is an insistence that computing culture could look wildly different than the one we know if the people that used them were given the rights to understand and control the code. This type of agency, they argued, would enable the computer to support types of learning, freedom, and artistic expression that are frequently seen as antithetical to the computer. However, while these folks were dreaming of a more democratic, educational, and creative form of computing, it was a completely different set of purposes that would dominate the development of software in both industry and academic settings. Industry began developing and selling computers for business and administration purposes, in which speed, efficiency, reproducibility, record-keeping, and administrative controls were prioritized at the expense of user agency, creativity, and social collaboration. And as a means to protect their intellectual property, computing companies locked down the code of their software to prevent users from modifying and sharing it. When the university took on these tools, they inherited a logic of computing intended for business and administrative contexts, rather than for learning and research. The word processor is one example of that. Though it may be hard for some of us to imagine the university without the word processor, there was indeed a time when computers were used differently for student writing. Before the word processor reached ubiquity in college education, there were experiments with student writing across the world using computer networks. This software did not prioritize correctness or the ability to revise multiple versions, but instead the ability to dialogue with others in far-off places. But word processing so thoroughly squashed this use of computing that when network student writing was rediscovered with the emergence of Web 2.0 technologies in the early 2000s, it was often described as completely novel. At any rate, by the end of the late 1960s, computation frequently appeared in popular discourse as a cold, mechanical, and oppressive force, especially in the US student protest movement of the 1960s. And the punch card, which you see here, one of the most visible cultural forms of computing, was often used to symbolize this alien force, such as in discourse satirizing or protesting administrative power in the university or political life. And so behind me, you see a political cartoon, right, where the university is basically a machine churning out students that are represented as punch cards. One more slide to demonstrate this. Here you see a student protester using a punch card with the word strike punched across it, and this is a common use of the punch cards during the student protest movement. Oh yes, and there's a quote, "I am a student of the University of California. Please do not fold, spindle, or mutilate me." And of course, those instructions are referring to the instructions of care for punch cards themselves. So this business and administrative form of computing still dominates the university's technology today, which is why you see university IT budgets predominantly directed towards educational technologies that manage or police students, like plagiarism detection tools and learning management systems, rather than supporting user freedom and collaboration. However, not only do these tools impose business and administrative logics on academic activities, they also prevent users from studying, transforming, sharing code as a means to protect intellectual property. And according to Frey's definition of oppression, we can call this a form of oppressive consumer computing. And as computing is increasingly used to support all of the different intellectual activities of the university, it becomes a key part of the university's information infrastructure. What's ironic, of course, is that the infrastructure which supports the production and dissemination of knowledge prohibits the production and dissemination of knowledge about the infrastructure itself. So to recap, oppressive consumer computing is a form of computing in which the user is denied the capacity to study, modify, or share the code, which would enable user agency at a collective level. These tools impose a worldview of their makers on the activities of their users. Unable to change these tools, the worldview is gradually accepted by the users as natural and inevitable. And finally, because this infrastructure is outside the sphere of intellectual sight and interest, novel technological evils like surveillance capitalism, behavior modification and prediction, digital censorship, digital exploitation, and so forth, have been able to storm the university without critical reflection. There are a few claims I want to make about this situation. By adopting these oppressive consumer computing technologies, the university inadvertently helped this form of computing become the dominant form of computing worldwide. And we can see this in a few ways. One, universities funded oppressive computing companies. In its early days, the technology company Apple, for example, saw school contracts as a core component of building their business, right? Steve Jobs himself said one of the things that built Apple II computers was schools buying Apple II computers. Two, universities helped oppressive computing companies develop market share. It is well known in the industry that universities are where tech companies, as well as other types of companies, compete to win loyal consumers for life. Three, universities taught students that oppressive computing culture was natural and inevitable by enforcing the use of these tools without consideration for alternatives. They reinforced the belief that a user should have little expectation of being able to study, govern, transform, or share the digital tools that shape their research, their teaching, their learning, and their lives. Or to put it differently, universities missed the opportunity to teach the academic community to demand that agency in their lives. I do not think the university intended this, but here we are. Okay, you might think that is politically unfortunate, but how is it intellectually relevant? In other words, how does this situation impact the character and outcome of thought, which I said I would show you? Well, one way we might see this is through Marx's lens of alienation. So let me do a little quote here. So what does Marx say about alienation? The alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him independently as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own, confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. I think it's really interesting to take this quote and replace worker with researcher or student and do all the additional replacements and see if you can make any meaning out of it. The alienation of the researcher or student in his knowledge means not only that his intellectual activity becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him independently as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own confronting him. So what do I mean by this? How is an academic's knowledge contributing to a hostile power that confronts him? Let's break it down. Okay. So I think, to give you an example of this, the easiest way to show you is in the context of surveillance capitalism, where technology companies harvest personal data to predict and modify human behavior for profit. We have oppressive consumer computing, right? And this imposes a worldview on academic information infrastructure, which restricts the academic study from looking at the key parts of the infrastructure itself. The academic community's use of these tools for research, teaching, and publication generates data that we might call alienated intelligence. This is data that is harvested by the companies that are providing the tools, right? It is the intelligence of the academic community, but transformed into profit that then enables the oppressive consumer computing companies to maintain dominance and expand, continually foreclosing the possibility of academics owning and directing their means of intellectual production. So in my research and technological practice, I became really interested in this cycle and attempts to intervene on this cycle. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Okay, so what did I do? Okay, so the first thing I did, sorry, this is confusing, animation. I'll just look at this.
Go ahead. If you,
Okay. All right, thank you. So, yeah, so the first thing I tried to do was take open source software and use that as an alternative to the proprietary technologies that are offered in the university. I don't think open source on its own enables agency and visibility into code bases, but it provides the conditions. It's a necessary requirement. By taking that technology and then, and using it to build academic infrastructure with the academic community. Okay, so this is really confusing me. This is too advanced. We then were able to build forms of academic technology that was based on our own values or on our own intellectual perspectives or curiosities, right? And then through that, oh yes, there's some perspectives for you. Who do we have here? Angela Davis. Ray, anyone else? No, okay. Okay, and then through that, we were able to replace alienated intelligence with something I'm thinking of as infrastructural agency, right? We are now, we own the means of our intellectual production, and so we also own that data, and we are also developing a form of consciousness that shows us the importance of that ownership and can help expand our imagination into its for a continued development. And what I was hoping is the more we did this, the more we explored, and of course we did it with $10 and with many struggles against administration and common practices within the university. Hopefully, by doing this more, by showing the value to it to communities, we could start actually reinforcing that practice to help continue that cycle. So that was the motivation of my interventions, and I'm going to show you a few examples of those. Oh, and I got my okay.
almost there.
Almost there. Wow. Okay. So one example is I worked with academics in San Diego at a variety of different universities, colleges, state colleges, community colleges to launch a social network platform for academics in the San Diego area. And as an open source platform, we were able to really own that platform. We had control over all the data that we produced on that platform, which enabled us to do several things. One, it's just actually shocking when you run a platform to see how much data is collected. We are rarely given that administrative view in the tools of everyday life. So I think just purely awareness of it can help spark your imagination about what are companies doing with this information, and then also maybe some curiosity about, well, could we do something of use with this data? It also allowed us to come together and govern this platform. Talk about what sort of data collection practices should we even allow, and what sort of uses of this data should we allow, what sort of privacy settings should we allow. Again, these decisions and discussions are completely foreclosed with most commercial forms of technology that we see in the institution. And so I found that this was very powerful within academic communities, but also very powerful in the classroom because students are rarely given this sort of agency with regard to their platforms. And for me, it helped me see that I don't think students are apathetic about, the growing problems of surveillance capitalism with our technology. It's just that they don't see any other possibilities. So actually, just by giving them examples of other possibilities is a really powerful pedagogical moment. Another thing I was really interested with these technologies, harkening back to the idea that networked writing was happening in the 60s, and then we completely forgot about it. I became interested in collaboration not as a binary, but as a whole suite of creative possibilities. And so I was really interested in exploring technologies to enact different forms of collaboration between communities, but also with the public. So one project I worked on also using open source technology was a project called Social Paper. And the idea, and I worked on this as a graduate student, the idea here was to sort of intervene on the often isolating process of student writing by creating a sort of social network for student writing. Some of you might look at this and, you know, think, oh, the horror, and maybe that's true, but I thought, you know, it's interesting, like why, you know, students spend so much time writing papers, but the only thing they post on social media is their cats and their dinner. So why, you know, why is this thing that they spend most of their time doing completely hidden from the sight of day? And wouldn't it be interesting if we could connect their intellectual activities with their, you know, social media activities in a way that might bring benefits to both spheres, right? One, make that intellectual activity more relevant to their everyday lives, and two, maybe make everyday life more informed by thought happening in the intellectual sphere. So this is a mock-up of kind of the design, the social feeds of social paper. We didn't quite realize all of our designs, but we did launch a prototype at the City University of New York, which was available for all 19 colleges in the CUNY system, and this was the first paper that was published on there. I published a little manifesto called "Why We Need a Social Paper." I continued this sort of exploration with networking, writing in the student space with my dissertation, and I created a project that I called Social Dis. This was back in 2016 or maybe even earlier, where I just continually put up drafts of my dissertation on every single social platform I could possibly think of. I'm actually a very introverted person, so this is a terrifying project, but the reason I did it was, okay, first of all, the platforms that I used were not platforms that enabled agency or control by any means. I was using Google and Facebook and Twitter and lots of different blogs and other proprietary network platforms to post this writing. But what I was interested in here was sort of demonstrating to myself and to anyone who cared to study this project that collaboration can look very, very, very different in different technological spaces. And indeed it did. And I found that the types of feedback I got, the types of discussion that were generated, the types of new knowledge that were unearthed during this project really, really differed according to the platform that I posted these papers. And so again, that was just another moment of like, why can't academics be more involved in shaping our technologies? Because obviously there is so much possibility out there, but you know, we're left with ResearchGate and Canvas, the learning management system. So I had some pictures of, oh, thank you. What would I do without you, Marcelo? These are different places that I posted. And here's just a screenshot of comments that I compiled that I got from the public. And one of the things that was really interesting for me as a graduate student was how many people engaged. Now, of course, this was a very historical moment, 2015, 2016, right? The internet is at a certain space and, you know, public interaction is at a certain space. There's trolls, but there aren't trolls like 2018 trolls, 2024 trolls, right? So maybe it was a safer time to do this kind of project. What I found so interesting is that the comments I got were from people I didn't know, were from the general public, were from professional academics much further along in their career that I had never met. It was such a validating way to be a graduate, a validating experience for a graduate student to suddenly engage with discussion with people, you know, from across my field, outside of my field. And again, it was a moment of there is so much more we could be doing with technology to support the intellectual practices that we want to support. So yeah, that's an example. So these were projects that explored the potential and the value of infrastructural agency. And another way you might understand them as attempts to begin developing what Christopher Kelty calls recursive publics. A recursive public is a public that is vitally concerned with the material and practical maintenance and modification of the technical, legal, practical, and conceptual means of its own existence as a public. That's a lot there, so, let that sink in. His other quote, I think, really clarifies this, right? Members of a recursive public use technology as a kind of argument for a specific kind of order. They argue about technology, but they also argue through it. They express ideas, but they also express infrastructures through which ideals can be expressed and circulated in new ways. So I find this is fascinating, right? The infrastructure itself is the intellectual argument. The shaping of the infrastructure is what allows certain types of ideas to emerge and be circulated. And there's a variety of examples that we can look at that can help us sort of appreciate this truth, right? The Free Software Foundation, which developed a ton of tools to enable, you're probably not, or I don't know if you're familiar with the Free Software Foundation or not, but they built, and maintain a lot of technologies that enable users, enable users the right, give the users the right to inspect code, share code, etc. And as part of that project, they develop a lot of tools to do that, but they also develop the tools that allow them to collaborate. And then they also develop the governance structures that allow them to decide how to collaborate. Other communities that also do this, open science, right, and infrastructure they have, they've built, and the governments that they've created to enable the free sharing of scientific research. The digital humanities, that's another example of a community that has built and experimented with tools to enable new forms of knowledge. Open education also. So I think we could go on there, but these communities are pioneers. Or I see them as pioneers for the university as a whole, by showing how technology can be this argument that has an impact on the character and outcome of intellectual activities. So these projects were very exciting to me, but they were also frustrating given their limitations, right? Because of the dominance of oppressive consumer computing, a dominance made possible by the extraction of wealth from our use of these tools, there are few resources and insufficient institutional will to support this kind of work. And then, of course, while this is all happening, who was there, off in the distance? Oh, wait, I'm sorry, not the current, wait, hold on, oh gosh. There we go. I did, not the Terminator.
Let me try.
Oh, where's Sam? It'll happen, it'll fit, okay. The Terminator is not supposed to be there, it's supposed to be Sam Altman. Sorry, that was my bad. Yeah, my bad.
Oh, there he is.
Okay, yeah, there. That's who I meant. That's who I meant. Yeah, so you're right, he came along, or maybe right, it wasn't him, it was just history happening through him, right? And history was called ChatGPT. We've talked a lot about this, and actually, in fact, I think I prefer the picture of the Terminator to the picture of Chat GPT, to be honest. Okay, so yeah, let's just stay with the Terminator. So right, we're seeing AI, flood our intellectual practices in academic settings and everyday life, and I hardly need to rehearse them, to you all today. We've heard about it today. We hear about it all the time. But right, students are using it for homework. Teachers are using it for grading. Media outlets are using it for the news. Researchers have been using it to write their research papers. Have you all seen the screenshots of research papers circulating where the prompts of ChatGPT are left? And, my goodness, wow. Artists and writers are using it, yada, yada, yada. And is it true that a Brazilian city enacted a law that was written by ChatGPT, or was that fake news? Was that true? I read that. Okay, we'll follow up. And there's been a great deal of, praise praise for AI, there's a lot of great things about it, I guess, or, there's things that we could say are beneficial, or some people say are beneficial, whether we agree with it or not. It can accelerate scientific discovery, it can help humans solve urgent health and environmental problems. It helps us save time, focus on the tasks that matter, and it can support accessibility, it can enhance productivity. I'm not gonna keep going, but I'm actually not being sarcastic. I think there are a lot of real world use cases of AI that can actually be valuable. But of course, there have also been, criticisms that you've heard today and elsewhere, right? Is AI contributing to the intellectual decline of humans? Although folks have been whining about that forever. Is AI, is it going to cause technological employment or displacement? Is it going to enable media manipulation and greater forms of misinformation? There's also the question of environmental costs of AI. There's also the problem that AI has generally been built on exploited data from users who had no idea that their data was going to go into building these systems. It also enables increased forms of surveillance. It reproduces racial and other biases, and it perhaps encourages an over-reliance on AI in many of our activities. So, there are so many concerns, like a dance party of concerns, and sometimes I think, maybe we shouldn't enjoy our concerns so much. But what's interesting to me is how artificial intelligence is showing up, in this reproductive cycle of oppressive computing. It is made, right, from the alienated intelligence of the users and used to engage more use, more user data production as a means to reinforce this oppressive consumer computing cycle. And so, in this context, the hope for agency and transparency over our software just seems further away from us than ever, right? We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know the databases that are used to train these AI systems. We don't know their biases, or, it's hard to get an omniscient view on them. We don't really understand what their perspective is, or the weights that are used, or the models, et cetera, and we certainly can't modify it. So that's a problem. I do want to say it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are, of course, oh, now over here. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay. There are many initiatives and projects that are seeking to steer this technology in a safe and beneficial direction, right? You see governments are working on regulation. Special interest organizations are developing ethical oversight groups. Educators are teaching critical digital literacy in the classroom. The open source community right now is actively working on a definition of what open source AI might mean. And meanwhile, engineers are also creating open source AI models that really are open to the community to freely use. Researchers are also putting forth ideas about moral alignment, and what that might look like in AI systems, or creating frameworks to increase visibility and explainability of these AI models. There are also lawyers pushing back on the exploitation of user data to create these models. So this is all very promising work. It's all very exciting, and I want to celebrate it. But I also want to, note that none of these responses are really about letting more users shape the technology according to their own needs and interests, right? None of these initiatives are about enabling infrastructural agency, about enabling users to collectively govern and develop tools for the user community's interests, or in our case, academic interests. None of these responses are helping thought grow greater awareness of its dynamic relationship with infrastructure. And so I don't think these responses are sufficient to address the oppressive logic within our information infrastructure. Okay. So the philosopher Trevor Kernow tells us that there is no single agreed upon definition of wisdom. And indeed, there likely never has been. This is true when you view what people have described as wisdom in different time periods and cultures, but also among the ancient Greeks themselves, who named philosophy after the love of wisdom. For Homer, wisdom could mean human mastery over a skill. For Pythagoras, who supposedly coined the term philosophy, wisdom was a quality only God could possess, not human beings. We can continue to collect different definitions. For Aristotle, wisdom is knowledge of first principles. For Cicero, a healthy condition of the soul. For St. Augustine, piety and devotion to God. Contemporary work in comparative psychology has suggested that Western conceptions of wisdom highlight logical thinking, whereas Chinese conceptions emphasize holistic thinking. But in most of these conceptions of wisdom, we can see a common thread. There is a sense of intelligence plus virtue. In other words, intelligence directed towards some good, perhaps the good. And implicit in these conceptions, I would argue, is a commitment to examining the foundations and effects of intelligence as part of its commitment to virtue. At the moment, much of our information infrastructure is designed around the idea of intelligence rather than intelligence plus virtue. Right? We do not have wise phones or artificial wisdom or wisdom networks. We have smartphones and artificial intelligence, neural networks, cognitive computing, and expert systems. The problems I have described regarding our information infrastructure are unproblematic if intelligence is the only goal. But if we replace wisdom as our guiding metaphor, intelligence plus virtue, we might begin to see the intellectual and philosophical contradictions inherent in the logic of our information infrastructure. Through that understanding, we might begin to see that the right to study and transform our information infrastructure is part of the responsibility of academic thought. While the realization of these rights are complex and will necessitate imaginative and practical work in social, technical, and educational dimensions, I believe they are conditions for intellectual agency in our current moment. Only with these freedoms and active engagement with them will we have the opportunity to see and develop our infrastructure, from writing technologies to artificial intelligence, as a type of argument or assertion about the value of human intelligence in the world. And so I have just two final questions for us. As knowledge makers in the 21st century, what is the good that we hope our thought might achieve? And to echo Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, how do we make sure our infrastructure isn't opposed to that good's advantage? And thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was a very thoughtful talk, and I'm sure there must be zillions of questions. But before we begin with the questions, I would like to announce that we have Marcelo Capello, who is the debater of this session. So Marcelo will have a few questions with Erin, and then we're open for questions in the audience.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you so much, Erin. It's a pleasure to finally listen to you after like an entire semester reading your dissertation and discussing it. It was very, very important for us, and we are thankful that you are here. So, well, I got a lot of notes here. Just a few comments and then some questions. I'm eager to go to the audience. I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of important things to discuss. So first, I like this idea that first we have to get the Luddites or the overall user into this building work, of shaping their tools. And there's this challenge of how to make them interested in dealing with that. And you showed some of the things that that you are doing regarding that. And I think this is a very important thing when we discuss interdisciplinarity, right? Without interdisciplinarity, we won't be able to achieve all of that. Also, I couldn't resist because you mentioned we put a picture of Plato and also there's a computer. So of course I was thinking about Plato's cave. And I was thinking like, well, right now we are like the prisoners looking at the wall and the shadows are everything that we use in our academic work. So maybe this discussion here is how do we get to break the chains, go behind the wall that we are chained to, and then try to build this shadow that we are seeing. Deal with that, deal with the objects that are from these images that we are seeing. So these are just some thoughts I had. Now, when you put the slide with Steve Jobs, I was thinking schools are like the point of entry of new oppressive technologies and therefore of these new worldviews. So what could education do beyond helping us become creative users? What kind of other wisdom should we provide in schools to discuss that? I would like to hear about that. Like, is there a kind of bulletproof vest to this massive invasion? Because we feel like we are not protected because we don't even understand how that happens. I'd like to think about other things we can do beyond dealing with the tools that we are using, because that, of course, is very, very important. Also, I was thinking maybe one of the barriers to stimulate people is that our lives are very concentrated in the tools that we use right now that are oppressive. Like our lives are on Google, not just our academic tools, but also our lives, our email, and a lot of social media that we use. So when we change to local tools, like the ones that you mentioned, San Diego, for instance, could this be a barrier to people to get into their own tools since they won't have this their centralized life so organized as Google technically provides us with? So, and again, I just want to say thank you for that, all that, and show that this is a very important discussion, not just on university and the education field, but beyond that. You mentioned the Brazilian law about the Brazilian law written by ChatGPT. I don't know if this is true, but everyone was looking so confused, like, oh, this could be true because, right? So if this could be true, then this problem goes a lot beyond education, a lot beyond university. So that's why we need to discuss it so much. So that's just some thoughts I'd like to hear.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments and those really great questions. Because you're right, getting students interested in this, building these projects, making sure that they're accessible to people is really, really, really hard. And I spent 10 years trying to do this work, and it was so hard. I'm taking a break from academia and I'm in tech at the moment. But I guess I'd say a few things. One, I can share my story. I never wanted to get into technology. I wanted to write novels. The reason that I am in technology now is because I, as a student, was exposed to open source technology, but not just open source technology. Again, I want to make a distinction. I don't think open source technology on its own is necessarily a good. I was exposed to open source technology that was being developed and governed by an academic community. And that was a transformative experience for me. And I happened to be reading Frey at the time and noticed all these parallels between, what, liberatory education should look like, how are you enabling people to collectively understand and co-create their world with the project of community governed software. And it was so vastly different than the experience of the learning management technology I was exposed to, which everyone, hates. I don't know how popular it is here in Brazil, which everyone can kind of feel from the teacher to the students, but this technology was not built by academics, right? It's very, it stifles some of your natural impulses for doing academic work. anyway, the experience, of how different, community governance software can be, compared to other forms of proprietary technology was very eye-opening for me, and that's the experience that I think, I just hope we can offer to more people in the community to at least build the will, because we need the will in order to fight for the resources and the other types of transformative change.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. Thank you, Marcel. You have. Yeah, so let's give the audience a chance to see Ralph, you the first one with them.
Oh, Erin, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I would like to ask you two questions. One is a bit personal, so if you don't want to answer it, that's fine by me. And that is that you said that you work now in tech, and not in the university sector. So you must experience an awful lot of pushback from what I would call the personifications of surveillance capitalism, the big tech industries, etc. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that and what form it comes and all the rest of it. But the other question is in relation to Marx. I thought that was a really interesting analogy. And of course, the interesting thing about Marx is that the only way that Marx thought you could overcome alienation is through class struggle. And I wonder whether virtue is enough in the context of the world we live in, and whether the social control you're asking for, where ordinary people co-create their world and their informational infrastructure, etc. How is that possible in a world, in a political economy dominated by capitalist interests? No, I don't expect you to give me the answer to that today. But I think it really is, if we continue with the capitalist world, are we ever going to get to that point we want? Which I agree with.
Yeah.
Do you want to take one more question? Yeah, maybe Erin can.
The easy question. Surveillance capitalism, very interesting. I am very, I only went to tech because I had an opportunity to work for a company that does not practice overtly surveillance capitalism, in that it is not a part of the business model. We are in the business of actually providing more forms of visibility into software. So that helps me sleep at night. But does that mean I can wash my hands of surveillance capitalism? No. People talk about surveillance capitalism being developed by the developers. It was developed by marketers, okay? Like, surveillance capitalism is, a way that marketers can attempt to understand users in order to sell you more things. And so our marketing department, like any tech marketing department, and also probably the university's marketing departments, use a variety of tools that are all about, putting cookies on websites and tracking user visits and trying to get to know as much as they possibly can about users. It's a problem, and I think we need just to continue driving awareness around it. But I think this problem connects to your second question about, like, how do we actually get rid of surveillance capitalism? How do we co-create our digital world with other people if we're in capitalism? And that's a great question. The challenge I experienced, firsthand, because I unfortunately did not overthrow capitalism with my community-driven software in higher education. I mean, I guess the only answer, I think everything you said is very valid, and my personal response is, like, we have to try where we can, and this is one area to try to do that. And I agree, right? Is virtue the thing that that is virtue enough for us to make this transformation. No, and I think I'm using virtue with the license of a literary scholar, not the accuracy of a philosopher. I'm thinking of virtue really simply as that good, that positive, North Star that we're trying to work towards. So maybe class struggle is your virtue, in that case. So yeah, I guess those are my, initial thoughts to your questions, but thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah. There is one at the back, there is, and two here in the front, so.
Yeah, you took away my question. Because I think it is a problem of political economy, right? It's a problem of capitalism. We talk about that a lot. And I don't have actually a question, but I was thinking about these issues like 10, 15 years ago, also in terms of open source bioinformatics, open source biotechnology. It was a big discussion, I guess, and it seems to have disappeared at the moment. But the thing you're talking about is what in Marxism and Bernard Stiegler's work is called proletarianization, right? In which knowledge is expropriated by capital and then accumulated in machines. In the 19th century, these were the machines of the industry, right? And in the 20th century, with the proletarianization of consumers. And now we're in the third stage of proletarianization of the intelligentsia, right? Sort of expropriation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Italian post-autonomist and openness tradition, who talk about the concept of the general intellect in Marxism. Are you familiar with that?
It's been a long time, but yes, it's ringing some distant bells. Please refresh my memory.
Yeah, that's the concept from the late Marx, from the Grundrisse, where he talks about expropriation of workers' knowledge in machines, to such an extent that these machines are then able to control and dominate workers. The same is happening now, of course, with artificial intelligence, right? Through which capital, in a way, reforms, reshapes the world, the societies in its own image, so to speak. And the question is, how can we fight them, of course? By creating an infrastructure of wisdom. I like that term a lot. But should we also take in terms of an infrastructure of desire for it? Okay? Because it's also a libidinal issue, I think. It's about the libido scendi that we need to regain.
I love that, because, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm battling already.
Oh, I love that because so much of this work is frustrating. I mean, looking at infrastructure all day long, you don't go to grad school because you wanna, look at source code and governance laws, or at least not most of us go to grad school for that reason. So I think figuring out how to, enable the desire, that desire in this work would be critical, yeah. Thank you for all your comments.
Good afternoon, Erin. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very, very insightful. And it's good to hear from a perspective that comes from actual tech. And I think I also good to hear this discussion. And first of all, I totally agree with you. The open source software shows itself in possibilities of opening and way of ourselves to technology. But I just have a worry. It comes also from the funding perspective, and it's our post-criticism. Imagining that's a possibility, we can actually refer to the open source there and break all this chain that you showed to us, right? We now have a free and democratic, especially free and democratic development of these technologies, and we name the artificial intelligence, but we cannot account for the unconscious relations and the unconscious that we are putting into it. It's going to be process, right? And this can actually bring about some problems. First of all, we have to change our paradigm or our understanding of how the education works. So we have to actually teach kids programming as something mandatory. Because we live in a world where, well, programming is also made as necessary nowadays as to English or Portuguese or mathematics or whatever. But at the same time, the power that we are enabling people is, well, it's going to be a very dire image, but it's not like a machine gun in the hands of people. How do we account for that? Because it's ideal that using especially trade, I like to reference it's all the native forces. It's going to be very interesting. Associated with new technology development. Because, yes, I understand that there are these factors in the moment, and we cannot account for them because they are in the way features. Always on our side.
I think that's a wonderful point, and indeed, right, I wrote this dissertation. It was published in 2018, but it was, the project was started much earlier. In the years after 2016, at least in the US, the sort of idealism of democratic possibility, I think has been really challenged.
Exactly.
And you look at the news, you look at the comment section, and you're like, I'd actually prefer Google to run Google than the comments, or the trolls to run Google, right? I agree. A book just came out by a friend and scholar who I really admire called Governable Spaces by Nathan Schneider, who's worked around technology, open source technology, community governance for a long time. And so this book is really about his work in creating governable spaces by Nathan Schneider, and it just came out. This book is about his work democratizing online spaces, and what he means by that is, well, first of all, he said that much of our technology embodies something called implicit feudalism, right? There's like this hierarchical power in many of the standard user roles in our technologies, right? You have the administrator, you have the editor, you have the author, you have the commenter. And so in his work, he's really sought to create more democratic roles to allow more people to govern this technology. I'm bringing him up because he also acknowledges your point, that communities in and of themselves, or even democracy in and of themselves, whatever democracy really actually means, right, isn't necessarily good. You could have a horrible community that's, enacting violence on people. You could have a democracy where everyone decides to destroy the environment, right? There's these examples. I don't really have an answer for you. Just one, I acknowledge your point, and I think this is a much bigger question about how are we reconsidering what democracy means, beyond technological questions and how we want to strive for that. And two, though, but like, what is the alternative, right? So it almost seems like we have to figure it out.
We are in the right path, and that's the one that is wrong with the communication. I think it's the right path. It's just that we have to come.
And it's interesting how you're bringing psychology. I hadn't thought about thinking about psychological impulses and this and how they come up. So thank you for that. That's very interesting.
We're gonna have one more question from the audience.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for your talk, it was amazing. I'd like to ask two questions that other people will have tried bring the topic forward. The first thing that comes to mind when you talk about surveillance capitalism is AI, generative AI. It's that right now we live in a asynchronous model of training AIs. So we have kind of a luxury of having the ability to interact with knowledge created online in a social context without the possibility of someone, if not surveilling our prompts and things like that, to have a more private engagement with social product of knowledge, of social knowledge. And right now, we're having some kind of startups trying to bring specialized devices for AI. So, which could, be used to, how can I say it? To run open source models of GPTs and things like that. And the other thing is, we are already getting to a point that training a model is no longer a great endeavor. You can personalize your model to what you want to do, including to create problems from zero, software from zero. And this also is a different paradigm of computation, a more natural computation that gets back towards people, not only to understand their software products, but the social technologies that you can do engaging with something that resembles more of a natural intelligence. So these two questions about empowerment of consumers, and if you can bring any clarity to this kind of reflection. Sorry for my broken English.
Oh, no, oh gosh, no, my goodness, that was beautiful. No, I really like your observations there. I think one of the things you're drawing out is that there are these really potentially progressive or democratic or agentful, giving agency aspects of AI, despite all of these other problems. Is that correct? Is that one of the things you're bringing up? And so I agree, it's actually really fascinating to, just not write off AI, off the bat and say like, no, this is oppressive, we have to get rid of it and done. I think there are really interesting use cases for it and potentially even progressive use cases for it, ways that will help communities, develop more agency. My only thought about how do we consider that is, do those so-called progressive aspects, do they enable communities to actually see what's happening and control what's happening and figure out as a community how to collectively do that and coordinate that, which is both technological work and sort of social collaboration governance work. So that's the way that's the question I keep returning to, is how is visibility and agency enabled in these different processes? And if it's not, what would it look like to build support for that? So I don't know if that helps, but good observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I think we don't have many questions online, so Edgar would like to ask a question and, so. Edgar. I have, so it's Edgar and one more question.
Thanks for your brilliant speech, Erin, and thanks for coming, for living in San Diego and here with us. We're talking about infrastructure of wisdom, and that philosophers have talked a lot about wisdom. What kind of wisdom do you have in mind when you talk about infrastructure of wisdom? Is that the kind of Sophia, kind of Phronesis? It came to me that as you love Paulo Freire, you may have in mind some kind of dialogicity, something that deals with language, with rhetoric. Am I wrong?
Oh, good question. What sort of wisdom do I have in mind for this infrastructure? I think part of me used that phrase to be provocative, to put the idea of wisdom in contrast to the idea of intelligence, which has been the guiding metaphor for our computing infrastructure. Because honestly, I don't think I have a very technical or crisp idea here, except that my point was we need to think about what is it that we want our intellectual activity to achieve? What is that good? Can we name it? can we name it? Because that's what we need to focus on when we build our technology. And I don't think any of us are satisfied anymore with, we just want to create knowledge. We just want to create knowledge to put in a computer, right? We want it to do something. We want it. And so it's almost my question to everyone, like, you know, can we reflect on that a little bit? And maybe it's not easy to answer right away, at least for those of us that aren't philosophers. So that's sort of a conversation I'm interested in having with people, but thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Erin. So just one very quick question, last one. I'm sorry for that,
I'll try to be very short. I was thinking about streaming platforms, and John is called Liz Berry, I think. She wrote an article about socialized streaming, and she would defend that we should think more about like of the data as a social resource that should be open. I think you were emphasizing the control of knowledge of how to view the software and understand it. I was thinking if there is some kind of movement towards getting control of our own data and about this, about socializing the product. I was thinking also about Jeremy Rifkin, which is not a Nazi, and says that there is a tendency of intellectual property to circulate freely, and that would lead to a problem with continuing profits. And so maybe the question is, instead of some kind of revolutionary action that would get us to some Marxist, whatever objective, isn't the whole AI dilemma getting us near some kind of collapse of the whole thing? I mean, because there's no, you have you need to have so much big mega investments to get so little profit, not so little profit, gigantic profit, but in such small amounts that actually make the business not possible anymore.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of interesting points in that comment. I know I have 20 seconds, so I'm just gonna pull one thing out of my hat. No, it's wonderful, thank you. That was wonderful. Just on your point about how expensive this infrastructure is to run and how could we ever possibly do it ourselves. One movement that comes to mind is the minimal computing movement, right? Who tries to build infrastructure with like the bare minimum, requirements. This movement is motivated by enabling computational access to folks with, really low internet bandwidth and so forth. So I think, right, we don't necessarily have to build an infrastructure that takes tons of computing power. We might be satisfied just with, flip phones and text editors, who knows? But anyway, that's my off the cuff answer. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. So I'd like everybody to join me in the